Norman P. Chase believed the roar of the diesel engine made him a god. Sitting high in the cab of the stolen excavator, his hands gripped the levers so tightly his forearms throbbed with a jagged, righteous heat. He had convinced himself this was a reckoning, that Tami M. Cole, a woman who had the audacity to build a world without him, needed to see that world reduced to dust and splinters. He shoved the joystick forward. The bookstore's front wall didn't just break. It buckled under the iron weight, a cacophony of shattering glass and pulverizing brick that drowned out the screams of the street. Norman stepped down from the machine, walking through the settling debris like a conqueror reclaiming a kingdom of ruins. He found Tami exactly where his cruelty expected her to be, standing in the wreckage of the history section, hands pressed to her head in a mask of pure, dust-covered devastation. Her trembling frame and the tears carving tracks through the soot on her face fed an ugly, hungry satisfaction deep inside him. He opened his mouth to deliver the final insult, to tell her she was nothing. But the words withered in the cooling air, because from the shadow of a still-standing pillar, leaning against a mahogany desk that should have been crushed, came a sound that turned Norman's blood to slush. The calm, rhythmic tapping of a smartphone screen. Rich L. Quinn didn't look up from the device. He stood in his charcoal suit, immaculate despite the chaos. The very picture of a man who didn't need to raise his voice because he already owned the ground everyone was standing on. Norman, the voice was quiet, clinical. I hope you have the insurance for this. Because I certainly do. The metallic roar of the diesel engine was the only thing Tami M. Cole could hear, a guttural, predatory sound that seemed to vibrate in her very marrow. She stood on the sidewalk, the morning air suddenly thick with the chalky taste of pulverized drywall and ancient paper. Before her, the history section, the corner of the shop where the floorboards always creaked with a comforting, aged dignity, was being systematically erased. The excavator's iron bucket punched through the brickwork with a sickening, wet crunch, the steel teeth dragging through the shelves. First editions and leather-bound memoirs fell like wounded birds, their pages fluttering briefly in the draft before being buried under a mountain of gray rubble. Tami's hands flew to her head, her fingers tangling in her hair as she let out a sound that was less a scream and more a ragged gasp of air. Every impact of the machine felt like a physical blow to her chest. This was the sanctuary she had built with the settlement money she'd hidden away, the place where the locks were strong and the names on the mail were finally hers. Now the wall was gone, exposing the intimate, shadowed interior of her life to the harsh, indifferent light of the street. High in the yellow cab, Norman P. Chase sat silhouetted against the dust, his face twisted into a mask of manic triumph. He didn't look like a man committing a crime. He looked like a man finishing a conversation. He swung the boom again, the heavy hydraulic hiss sounding like a satisfied sigh as the biographies followed the history books into the abyss. He wanted her to see it. He wanted her to understand that no matter how many miles she put between them, or how many open signs she hung in the window, his reach was longer than her hope. Tami fell to her knees, the grit of the sidewalk stinging her skin, her eyes locked on the jagged hole where her front door used to be. Through the rising cloud of debris, she saw the silhouette of her favorite armchair, now tilted precariously over a pile of broken masonry. The world felt tilted, too unmoored and violent. She waited for the next strike, for the final collapse that would take the roof and the memories with it. But instead, the engine's roar suddenly dipped, tapering off into a low, mechanical whine before cutting out entirely. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise. It was a heavy, expectant quiet that settled over the ruins like a shroud. Tami looked up through the settling haze, her vision blurred by tears and soot, and that was when she saw him. He wasn't running. He wasn't screaming. Standing near the remains of the main desk, surrounded by a jagged crown of broken timber, was Rich L. Quinn. He was adjusting his cufflinks with the precise, unhurried movements of a man preparing for a gala, seemingly indifferent to the fact that a 3-ton machine was idling in his foyer. He looked at the wreckage, then slowly turned his gaze toward the excavator, his expression not one of fear, but of profound, clinical disappointment. The dust didn't settle so much as it hovered, a suspended ghost of Tami's hard work shimmering in the mid-morning sun. Through the jagged mouth of the building, where the history section had once stood as a testament to the past, the present arrived in the form of a man who looked entirely out of place among the ruins. Rich L. Quinn stepped over a shattered beam with the practiced ease of someone walking through a gallery. His charcoal suit was a sharp, dark void against the pale plaster dust, his white shirt collar still crisp enough to cut glass. He held a smartphone to his ear, his posture so relaxed it was jarring, a vertical line of absolute order in a world that Norman had just turned horizontal. Tami stayed on her knees, her breath hitching in her throat, watching the man move. He didn't look at the excavator, and he didn't look at the crowd of onlookers beginning to gather behind the police tape in the distance. Instead, his eyes tracked the ceiling joists, his head tilting slightly as he assessed the structural integrity of the remaining walls. He wasn't looking at the destruction as a tragedy. He was looking at it as a ledger, a series of numbers and liabilities being tallied in real time behind a mask of cold, professional indifference. "I'm looking at the south-facing wall now," Quinn said into the phone, his voice a low, resonant baritone that carried easily through the silent street. "The support columns are compromised. We'll need the structural team down here by noon. And call the insurance adjusters. Tell them I'm personally overseeing the claim." He paused, listening to the voice on the other end, his thumb tracing the edge of his cufflink. His presence radiated a quiet, terrifying gravity that seemed to pull the very air out of the street. It was the kind of calm that didn't need to assert itself because the environment had already conceded to it. He finally lowered the phone, the screen's glow fading as he slipped it into his breast pocket. Only then did he turn his gaze toward the yellow machine idling in the center of the wreckage. In the cab of the excavator, the manic grin had begun to slip from Norman's face, replaced by a flickering uncertainty. He was used to Tami's terror. He fed on the sight of her brokenness. But the sight of this man who looked like he owned the deed to the sidewalk and the sky above it, was a variable he hadn't calculated. Norman wiped a streak of grease across his forehead, his hand trembling just enough to notice. He had come here to be the biggest thing in Tami's world, to be the storm that leveled her life. But as Quinn looked up at him, Norman suddenly looked very small inside his iron cage. Quinn didn't speak immediately. He reached down and picked up a stray book that had landed near his polished Oxfords, a biography of a long-dead king. He brushed a layer of grit from the cover with a slow, deliberate motion, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, until the only sound left was the cooling ping of the excavator's engine. When Quinn finally looked at Norman, his eyes were as flat and gray as the debris. "You've had a very busy morning, Norman," Quinn said. It wasn't a question and it wasn't a greeting. It was an opening statement in a trial that Norman hadn't realized was already underway. Quinn took a step closer to the machine, his shadow lengthening across the broken bricks. "But I think you've mistaken my property for your playground. And that is a very expensive mistake to make." Tami watched from the ground, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She looked from her ex-boyfriend, the man who had haunted her nightmares, to the man in the black suit who had lived in the shadows of her basement. For the first time in years, the fear that had kept her paralyzed began to shift. It wasn't gone, but it was being overshadowed by something larger, something colder, and something far more dangerous than Norman P. Chase could ever hope to be. Quinn finally looked down at her, a brief, sharp glance that held more recognition than she expected, before returning his attention to the man in the cab. The power in the air didn't just shift, it crystallized. The predator was no longer at the controls of the machine. The predator was standing in the dust, waiting for the apology he knew was never going to be enough. Norman didn't jump from the cab. He descended the metal ladder with a slow, heavy deliberation, his boots ringing against the steel rungs like a countdown. He was a man savoring a masterpiece. As his feet finally hit the gravel and glass of the ruined storefront, he didn't look at Rich L. Quinn. He didn't even seem to notice the way the air had curdled into something dangerously cold around the man in the charcoal suit. His eyes were fixed entirely on Tami, who remained collapsed on the periphery of the wreckage, her hands still trembling against her hair. He walked toward her, kicking aside a shredded copy of a classic novel as if it were common trash. The adrenaline from the destruction was still humming through him, giving his movements a jagged, electric edge. He stopped just a few feet from her, towering over her broken sanctuary, his chest puffed out with a frantic, hollow pride. The dust on his face was streaked with sweat, making his grin look like a white scar in the morning light. "Look at you, Tami," he said, his voice raspy and thick with a dark, intimate satisfaction. "Look at this little dollhouse you thought you could hide in." He gestured vaguely at the exposed skeleton of the building, the jagged wood and twisted metal framing them like a stage. "You really thought you could just turn the page? Close the book and pretend I didn't exist?" Tami didn't look up, but her shoulders pulled inward, a reflexive flinch that only seemed to embolden him. Norman leaned down, his shadow stretching over her, suffocating and familiar. This was the dynamic they had lived in for years, the gravity of his rage keeping her pinned to the floor. To him, the destruction of the bookstore wasn't just a tantrum. It was a correction. He was resetting the world to its proper order, where she was small and he was the only force that mattered. "I told you once, didn't I?" Norman continued, his voice dropping to a low, conversational hiss that ignored the silent observer standing 10 feet away. "I told you that everything you have because I let you have it. You wanted to run a business? You wanted to be the lady of the manor? Fine. But you needed to be reminded, Tami. You needed a real, permanent reminder of exactly who I am and exactly how little all of this means when I decide I'm done playing." He reached out, his hand hovering near her shoulder as if to reclaim a piece of property, his fingers twitching with the urge to feel her terror physically. He was so consumed by the justice of his own violence that he had completely misinterpreted the silence of the street. He thought the quiet was a tribute to his power. He thought the man in the black suit was just another witness to his greatness, another spectator watching the lion reclaim his territory. "You're going to come with me now," Norman said, his tone shifting into a terrifyingly calm command. "We're going to leave this trash where it belongs, and we're going to start over, properly this time." He finally straightened up, casting a dismissive, sidelong glance at Rich L. Quinn, who had remained perfectly still, watching the exchange with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a particularly dull insect. Norman's lip curled into a sneer. He saw the suit, the phone, and the polished shoes, and he saw a man who had never had to bleed for anything. In Norman's world, the person with the loudest engine and the heaviest hands won. He had no idea that he was currently standing in the center of a different kind of architecture. One where power didn't need to roar because it already owned the silence. "And you?" Norman barked at Quinn, pointing a grease-stained finger toward the man's chest. "You can call whoever you want. Call the cops, call the mayor. Tell them Norman Chase was here. Tell them I'm done taking no for an answer." He turned back to Tami, his hand finally dropping to grip her arm, his knuckles white with the effort of reasserting his grip on her life. He was a man who believed he had just written the final chapter. He didn't realize that, in the eyes of the man in the black suit, he hadn't even finished the prologue to his own undoing. He was still gloating over the reminder he had delivered, blissfully unaware that the real lesson was about to begin, and it wouldn't be taught with an excavator, but with a ledger that was already deeply, lethally in the red. Rich L. Quinn did not move, yet the space around him seemed to contract, drawing every ounce of warmth from the dust-heavy air. He remained leaning against the mahogany desk, one of the few pieces of furniture that had survived the initial impact, and watched Norman with the heavy, unblinking patience of a predator that had already won. The grease-stained finger Norman pointed at him didn't even register as a threat. To Quinn, it was merely an untidy gesture from an untidy man. As Norman's hand tightened on Tami's arm, pulling her toward the jagged exit, Quinn finally stood straight. The movement was fluid and silent, the rustle of his charcoal suit sounding like a sharpening blade. "Norman," Quinn said. His voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a resonant authority that sliced through Norman's frantic bravado. "There is a fundamental lack of etiquette in your approach this morning. My mother used to say it was exceptionally rude to destroy another person's home. But then again, you were never very good at listening to instructions. Were you?" Norman froze. The name, spoken with that specific, chilling familiarity, hit him like a physical barrier. He slowly turned his head, his grip on Tami's arm loosening just enough for her to pull back a fraction. He squinted through the haze, his eyes searching Quinn's face, trying to place the voice beneath the shadow of the expensive suit. "Who the hell are you?" Norman barked, though the roar had lost its edge, replaced by a thin, vibrating tension. "I don't know you. I'm handling family business here. Walk away while you still have your teeth." Quinn took a single step forward, his polished Oxford shoe crushing a piece of fallen crown molding. "Family business is such a tedious euphemism for a lack of self-control," he remarked, his gaze drifting momentarily to the gaping hole in the storefront. "You see, Norman, you spent the last hour convinced you were tearing down Tami's sanctuary. You thought you were erasing her independence, brick by brick. It's a common delusion among men of your limited stature." Quinn paused, reaching into his pocket to retrieve a small, silver lighter. He didn't light anything. He simply turned it over in his fingers, the metal catching the morning light. "The problem is that you didn't check the foundation. You were so focused on the woman that you forgot to look at the dirt beneath her feet. This building, the air you're currently polluting with that diesel engine, and the very bricks you've turned into gravel. They don't belong to Tami. And they certainly don't belong to you." He stepped closer, moving into the light until the sharp, predatory lines of his face were fully revealed. "They belong to me," This isn't just a bookstore, Norman. It's an investment, an asset, and you have just performed an unauthorized demolition on a property owned by the Quinn Holdings Group. The color drained from Norman's face, leaving the soot and sweat standing out in stark, ugly relief. The name Quinn didn't just carry weight in this neighborhood. It carried a death sentence for anyone foolish enough to touch what was his. The excavator, which had felt like a throne moments ago, now looked like a bright yellow tomb. I didn't know, Norman stammered, his voice jumping an octave as he instinctively stepped back, away from Tami, away from the man in the suit. I thought it was her name on the lease. You were just proving how dangerous you are. Quinn interrupted, his tone shifting from clinical to something infinitely darker. And you succeeded. You've proven to me that you are a liability that can no longer be ignored. You didn't just break a wall, Norman. You broke my silence. And in my world, that is a debt that cannot be settled with an apology. Quinn turned his head slightly, looking at Tami. For a brief second, the ice in his eyes seemed to thin, acknowledging her presence not as a victim, but as the only other person in the room who understood the gravity of the shift. Then he looked back at Norman, his thumb clicking the lid of the lighter shut with a final metallic snap. You've spent your life reminding people who you are, Norman. Now, I'm going to spend the rest of the morning reminding you who I am. The memory of the heavy, cold weight of the keys felt as vivid in Norman's mind as the sweat currently stinging his eyes. 14 months ago, he hadn't been a man behind the controls of an excavator. He had been a man behind the wheel of a black sedan, a low-level ghost in the Quinn machinery. He had been a driver, trusted just enough to be invisible but never enough to be respected. It was that invisibility, that persistent, grinding sense of being overlooked, that had led him to the desk in the syndicate's secure garage. The office had been empty, the air smelling of oil and expensive cigars. The keys had been sitting there, a heavy brass ring holding the electronic fobs to the special interest transport vehicles, the armored fleet used for the kind of cargo that never appeared on a manifest. To anyone else, they were just tools of the trade. To Norman, they were leverage. He had snatched them in a moment of frantic, unthinking impulse, sliding them into his pocket and feeling the metal bite into his thigh. He had convinced himself it was a backup plan, a way to ensure he was never discarded, like the other drivers who outlived their usefulness. But the syndicate didn't lose things. Within 48 hours, the atmosphere in the garage had shifted from professional indifference to a predatory stillness. Norman had felt the walls closing in, the silent questions behind every glance from the senior enforcers. Panicked, he hadn't returned them. Instead, he had sought out Tami, weaving a frantic lie about valuable collectibles he needed to store for safekeeping. He had tucked the brass ring into the hollowed-out spine of a first-edition law text in her restricted archive, hiding his sin in the one place he thought Quinn's shadow would never reach, a quiet, dusty corner of a woman's dream. He had spent months looking over his shoulder, waiting for the hand on his collar, eventually convincing himself that he had outsmarted the smartest man in the city. He had used the keys as a secret talisman of power, a private joke against the world that treated him like a servant. But as he stood now in the wreckage of the bookstore, looking into Rich L. Quinn's gray, immobile eyes, the weight of those stolen keys felt like an anchor dragging him into the deep. "You always did have a sticky reach, Norman," Quinn said, his voice cutting through the flashback like a scalpel. He didn't need to describe the theft. The way he looked at Norman's trembling hands made it clear that the unauthorized demolition wasn't the first time Norman had touched something that didn't belong to him. You thought those keys were your insurance policy. You thought that by placing them in this building, you were making them disappear. Quinn took another slow, deliberate step forward, the crunch of glass beneath his heel sounding like a bone breaking. But all you did was give me a reason to pay very close attention to this particular address. You didn't just steal a piece of metal, Norman. You stole time, my time, and that is a commodity I value far more than a fleet of cars. Norman's breath came in ragged, shallow bursts. The realization that his secret had been a neon sign for the last year was more crushing than the excavator's bucket. He had thought he was the architect of his own revenge, but as he looked at the ruins of the history section, he realized he had been nothing more than a delivery boy, bringing the wrath of the syndicate directly to Tami's door. He had hidden the keys to frame her if things went south, a final, spiteful insurance policy against the woman who dared to leave him. Now, he was realizing that in Rich L. Quinn's world, there were no insurance policies, only debts and the inevitable violent collection of interest. The dust from the demolition hung in the air like a heavy, gray curtain, but the silence between the three of them was sharper than the splintered glass underfoot. Rich L. Quinn didn't look at the excavator, nor did he look at the crowd of curious witnesses gathering at the edge of the police tape. His focus remained entirely on Norman, his gaze possessing the weight of a physical restraint. "You've always had a flair for the dramatic, Norman," Quinn said, his voice a low, melodic contrast to the wreckage. "But drama is expensive, especially when it's used to cover up a clumsy attempt at insurance." Norman wiped a smear of soot across his forehead, his breath hitching in his throat. "I don't know what you're talking about. This is between me and her. This is personal." "Everything is personal once it touches my ledger," Quinn replied, stepping further into the ruins of the history section. He reached down and pulled a heavy, leather-bound volume from a pile of debris. The spine was cracked, the gold lettering of a law text partially obscured by plaster dust. You see, Tami has a very specific way of organizing her restricted archive. She values order. She values the sanctity of the written word. Which is why it was so incredibly jarring when my associates found a brass ring of keys tucked inside the hollowed-out pages of Blackstone's commentaries 3 months ago. The color drained from Norman's face, leaving it the shade of the very dust that coated the floor. He instinctively looked toward the back of the store, toward the small, locked room where Tami kept the rare editions. "You thought you were being clever," Quinn continued, turning the book over in his gloved hands. "You thought that by stashing the keys to my transport fleet in the one place I'd never look, a quiet bookstore run by the woman you've spent years trying to break, you were creating a safety net. If I found them, you'd claim she stole them to spite you. If she found them, you'd use them as leverage to keep her under your thumb. It was a strategy built on the assumption that I am as short-sighted as you are." Tami looked from the book in Quinn's hand to Norman, her eyes wide with a new kind of realization. The gift Norman had insisted on leaving in her care months ago, the one he had threatened her never to touch, hadn't been a memento of their past. It had been a weapon he'd planted in her home, a timed explosive waiting to destroy her if she ever truly moved on. I wasn't going to use them," Norman stammered, his voice losing its gravelly edge and thinning into a whine. "I just needed a place to keep them safe. I was going to bring them back." "You brought them back the moment you decided to drive an excavator through the front door," Quinn said, his expression shifting from clinical to predatory. "You see, Norman, I've known where those keys were since the day after you took them. I left them there because it was convenient. It gave me a reason to keep an eye on this property. It gave me a reason to ensure that Tami was protected from outside interference. Quinn tossed the hollowed-out book onto the pile of rubble at Norman's feet. The sound of it hitting the debris was as final as a gavel. But now the archive is open, the keys are back in my possession, and you've managed to turn a simple theft into a very public, very noisy liability. You didn't just destroy a wall, Norman. You destroyed the one thing that was keeping you alive. My indifference. As Quinn spoke, two men in dark, well-tailored suits materialized from the shadows of the remaining bookshelves, their presence as silent and inevitable as the settling dust. Norman looked at them, then back at Quinn, the realization finally sinking in that the excavator wasn't the most powerful thing in the room. He had spent the morning trying to remind Tami of who he was, only to find himself standing in the ruins of his own making, facing a man who didn't need a machine to tear a life apart. The desperation that had been simmering beneath Norman's bravado finally boiled over, curdling into a frantic, cornered energy. He looked at the two men in the dark suits, then back at Quinn, his eyes darting like a trapped bird's. The power of the excavator, the weight of the steel, the justice of his revenge. It all evaporated, leaving him standing in the dirt as nothing more than a small man who had stepped into a very large trap. "I'm not staying for this," Norman spat, his voice cracking. "You want your building? You want your books? Fine, take him. I'm done here." He made a sudden, lunging move toward the jagged gap in the wall, intending to scramble over the pile of bricks and disappear into the gathering crowd on the street. It was a move born of raw instinct, a frantic bid for the anonymity of the city. But the escape route didn't just close. It vanished. Quinn's associates didn't run. They didn't shout. They moved with a terrifying, fluid grace, appearing in his path the way water moves downhill. Effortless, inevitable, and impossible to stop. One moment, the way to the street was open. The next, a wall of charcoal wool and silent intent stood between Norman and the outside world. He spun around, his boots skidding on a slick piece of book cover, only to find the second man already behind him, cutting off the path back to the excavator. The geometry of the room had changed. The wreckage was no longer a stage for Norman's ego. It was a cage. "The exits are currently closed for maintenance, Norman," Quinn said, his tone conversational, as if he were discussing a minor delay in a business meeting. He hadn't moved from the mahogany desk, yet he dominated every inch of the debris. "And I find that men who run usually have something else hidden in their pockets. Something besides my keys." Norman swung wildly, a desperate, unpracticed punch aimed at the man nearest the street. The enforcer didn't even flinch. He simply caught Norman's wrist in a grip that felt like a closing vice, his expression remaining as neutral as a statue's. With a sharp, clinical efficiency, the man twisted Norman's arm behind his back, forcing him down into the grit. There was no struggle, no cinematic brawl. It was a professional mark, a swift, administrative subduing that stripped Norman of the last remains of his dignity. Tami watched from the sidelines, her breath coming in shallow hitches. For years, Norman had been the storm, the unstoppable force that broke everything in its path. Now, seeing him pinned to the floor by men who didn't even seem to be breathing hard, the myth of his power crumbled. He wasn't a monster. He was just a nuisance being cleared from a construction site. "Let me go," Norman muffled into the dust, his face pressed against a shattered copy of a history text. "You can't do this." There are witnesses. People saw. Quinn looked toward the police lights flickering in the distance, then back at the man on the ground. Witnesses saw a tragic accident involving a stolen excavator and an unlicensed operator, Quinn remarked, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt colder than the morning air. They saw a man who didn't know when to stop taking things that didn't belong to him. Everything else, Norman, is just paperwork. The enforcer tightened his grip, and Norman's protest died into a low, whimpering groan. The stillness returned to the bookstore, a heavy, expectant quiet that signaled the end of the noise and the beginning of the reckoning. Quinn looked down at his watch, the gold casing glinting through the haze. The time for reminders was over. The time for settlement had arrived. The struggle didn't end with a bang, but with the clinical, rhythmic precision of a machine being powered down. Norman thrusted his shoulders, a final, desperate heave that was less about escape and more about reclaiming the illusion of his own strength. But the enforcer holding him didn't engage with the emotion of the movement. He simply shifted his weight, applying a calculated pressure to the nerve cluster behind Norman's ear. It was a functional subdual, a stripping away of resistance that left Norman gasping. His face pressed so hard against a fallen brick that the dust filled his open mouth. "Careful with the inventory, Elias," Quinn murmured, his voice drifting over the wreckage like a cooling breeze. "He's already caused enough depreciation for 1 fiscal year." The enforcer, Elias, didn't nod. He simply adjusted his grip. With a practiced, fluid motion, he pulled Norman's wrists together, the zip ties biting into the skin with a sharp, plastic hiss that sounded like a final door closing. There was no room for the theatrical rage Norman had walked in with. The excavator sat idling behind them, a yellow monument to a failed rebellion, its heavy diesel heartbeat slowing as the fuel lines were cut by the second associate. Norman's performed dominance. The puffed chest, the weaponized roar, the swagger of a man who thought he could break a woman's life with iron and engine, crumbled into a raw, undefended shock. He looked up from the dirt, his eyes wide and glassy, fixed on Quinn's polished shoes. The grit on his tongue and the cold plastic on his wrists were the new reality, a physical manifestation of the fact that he was no longer the author of his own story. He was a line item being deleted. You can't just take me," Norman managed to wheeze, though the words lacked the conviction of his earlier threats. They were the sounds of a man realizing for the first time that the rules he lived by, the rules of the street and the barroom, did not apply to the man in the charcoal suit. "The police, they're right there." Quinn finally walked toward him, his shadow falling over Norman like a shroud. He stopped just inches away, looking down with an expression of mild, weary curiosity. "The police are currently occupied with the report of a stolen construction vehicle and a catastrophic property accident. By the time they sort through the insurance filings I've already submitted via my legal team, you will be an administrative footnote. You aren't being taken, Norman. You are being retired from active service." Elias hauled Norman to his feet, but the man who stood up was not the man who had climbed down from the cab. Norman's knees were weak, his head lolling as if the very bones of his neck had lost their resolve. He looked at Tami, searching for the familiar flicker of terror that had always validated his existence, but he found only a hollow, exhausted silence. She wasn't cowering anymore. She was watching him be processed, her expression as distant as a stranger's. The second associate stepped forward, a black SUV gliding silently into the gap in the wall where the history section used to be. The vehicle looked like a predator entering a lair, its tinted windows reflecting the chaos of the street. Norman tried to plant his feet, a last, pathetic attempt at agency, but the enforcers moved him with the effortless gravity of a tide. He didn't fight back this time. He couldn't. The shock had settled into his marrow, a cold realization that he had crossed a threshold into a world where his violence was merely a loud noise, and Quinn's silence was the only thing that carried weight. "One last thing, Norman," Quinn said, his voice dropping to a whisper that only the two of them could hear as Elias guided the prisoner toward the open door of the SUV. "The keys were a clever touch, but in my world we don't use keys anymore. We use leverage, and you've just given me enough to ensure you never walk on a sidewalk I own again." The door of the SUV clicked shut, a heavy, muffled sound that swallowed Norman's whimpering protest. The vehicle didn't speed away. It moved with a slow, administrative grace, merging into the morning traffic as if it were just another part of the city's pulse. Tami stood in the center of her ruined dream, the dust finally beginning to settle, watching the red taillights vanish. The noise was gone. The monster was gone. All that remained was the quiet, clinical presence of the man who had decided that her bookstore was worth more than Norman Chase's life. The red taillights of the SUV faded into the morning traffic, leaving a vacuum where Norman's frantic violence had once been. The street remained oddly quiet, the few distant witnesses now mere silhouettes behind the glare of police lights. Tami stood in the center of the wreckage, her feet planted in a drift of pulverized brick and shredded paper. She looked at the hole in her life, the place where the history section had stood, and felt a hollow, ringing sensation in her ears. The monster was gone, but the sanctuary was a skeleton. Rich L. Quinn did not offer a hand to help her up, nor did he offer a hollow apology for the chaos. He simply watched her for a moment, his expression regaining that clinical, administrative neutrality. He reached into the inner pocket of his charcoal jacket and withdrew a thick, cream-colored envelope. It didn't look like a legal document. It looked like an invitation. "This building served its purpose, Tami," Quinn said, his voice carrying clearly through the settling dust. "It was a quiet place. A place where people didn't look too closely at the basement or the archives. I appreciate the discretion you didn't even know you were providing." He stepped over a broken ceiling joist, moving toward her with a measured, rhythmic gait. He held the envelope out, the paper heavy and expensive against the soot on Tami's fingers. "Norman was right about one thing," Quinn continued, his eyes meeting hers with a flash of cold, gray recognition. "You did need a reminder, but not of his power. You needed a reminder that the world doesn't belong to the loudest man in the room. It belongs to the one who owns the ground." Tami took the envelope, her fingers trembling as she broke the wax seal. Inside was not a check, but a single heavy sheet of vellum and a set of silver keys that felt cold and solid in her palm. It was a deed not to this ruined shell, but to a property on the north side, in a district where the streets were lined with ancient oaks and the precinct was on the payroll of men who valued absolute silence. "The new location is larger," Quinn remarked, as if he were discussing a simple inventory upgrade. "The shelves are floor-to-ceiling mahogany. The security system is integrated directly into my private network. It's a space that represents a meaningful number of choices, Tami. Choices that are now entirely yours to make." Tami looked at the deed, then back at the man who had used her life as a strategic front. She realized then that the envelope wasn't just compensation for the bricks and mortar. It was a settlement for the year she had spent living in a shadow she hadn't understood. Quinn wasn't giving her a gift. He was balancing a ledger. He was ensuring that the woman who had kept his secrets, however unknowingly, was placed somewhere where her peace would never again be interrupted by a man with a stolen excavator. "Why?" Tami whispered, her voice finally finding its strength through the shock. Quinn adjusted his cufflink one last time, a sharp, metallic click that signaled the end of the meeting. "Because I find that a well-run bookstore is an excellent addition to a neighborhood. And because I don't like it when people break things I've decided to protect." He turned away, his silhouette sharp against the morning sun as he walked toward a second, waiting sedan. Tami stood alone among the scattered books and the scent of diesel, the heavy envelope pressed against her chest. For the first time in years, the weight she felt wasn't the suffocating pressure of a threat, but the solid, undeniable reality of a future. She looked down at the silver keys in her hand, the light catching their jagged edges, and realized that while the history of this place was buried in rubble, the next chapter had already been signed, sealed, and delivered. The second sedan pulled away with the same clinical, unhurried grace as the first, its tires whispering over the grit and glass until the sound was swallowed by the city's morning hum. Tami remained exactly where she stood, the heavy cream envelope clutched to her chest like a shield. The dust had finally begun to settle, no longer a frantic cloud but a thin, gray veil that coated the remains of her world. She looked at the jagged gap where the history section had once been, the morning sun now pouring through the hole and illuminating the thousands of dust motes dancing in the air. She stepped deeper into the wreckage, her boots crunching over the broken spine of a biography. Around her lay the physical debris of Norman's rage. Splintered oak, twisted metal, and the white, fluttering pages of books that had been her only company for years. But as she surveyed the ruin, the crushing weight of the past hour began to lift, replaced by a strange, buoyant clarity. For the first time since she had met Norman P. Chase, the air in the room didn't feel crowded by his presence. The reminder he had intended to leave her had been overwritten by the cold, absolute authority of a man who didn't even know her middle name. Tami walked toward the mahogany desk where Rich L. Quinn had stood. She reached out and touched the wood, her soot-stained fingers tracing the smooth, polished surface that had survived the storm. The silence of the bookstore had changed. It was no longer the brittle, defensive silence of a woman hiding in a corner, waiting for a door to splinter. It was the vast, open silence of a clean slate. The roar of the excavator, the snap of the zip ties, and the low, melodic threats of the Mafia boss had all faded, leaving behind a radical, unremarkable quiet. She looked down at the silver keys in her hand. They were heavy, their edges sharp and real. They didn't represent a hiding place. They represented a destination. She thought of the new location Quinn had described, the floor-to-ceiling mahogany, the secure network, the meaningful number of choices. She realized then that she wasn't just standing in the ruins of a bookstore. She was standing at the end of a long, dark corridor she had been walking through for years. Norman had tried to bury her under the bricks of her own sanctuary, but he had only succeeded in breaking the walls that had kept her trapped in his orbit. A soft breeze drifted through the ruined storefront, carrying the scent of rain and distant exhaust. Tami closed her eyes and took a long, deep breath, letting the cooling air fill her lungs. There were no sirens approaching, no heavy footsteps on the stairs, no shadow looming over her shoulder. Just the distant sound of the city waking up to a Tuesday morning that didn't know her name. She turned and began to walk toward the back office to gather what was left of her personal things. She didn't hurry. She moved with a slow, deliberate patience, picking her way through the history section with a steady hand. The glass rang faintly beneath her feet, a small, clear sound in the early light. It was the sound of something broken being left behind. As she stepped out of the shadows and into the full, unapologetic glow of the sun, Tami M. Cole realized that the silence was finally safe. It was just her, the morning, and the quiet, radical fact of a life that was, for the first time in years, entirely and unambiguously her own.